There's also RESTful APIs, and I'm going to talk a bit more about those in a minute. And of course, Alfresco is open source, so to some extent you can customize what you want, you can use it what you want, you can see the code underneath. I would recommend you try and stick to our public APIs, public Java APIs, or the public REST APIs, CMIS. That'll help you in the future. Okay, so a little bit of history. About a year ago, we launched the Alfresco public API in the cloud, and that code is now in Alfresco 4.2. And it's a combination of CMIS plus RESTful, our own RESTful API. And what happened was the great minds at Alfresco got together and decided what is a RESTful API? What is a true RESTful API? Because we've got a lot of APIs, and I confess I've always written APIs and maybe called them RESTful on my CV, but it's not just HTTP with a GET. You know. So the great minds at Alfresco got together, tried to agree on what they thought a RESTful API was, and out of that became the Alfresco public API, which has been in the cloud for a year and now is available on 4.2. And our mobile clients and anybody writing apps uses that API. And it's a combination of CMIS, this standard, and REST. So CMIS is used for folders, files, content, anything to do with files and documents. And the RESTful API adds on the things that Alfresco adds on. So sites, people, comments, tags, favorites, and workflow. And I wonder if anybody can guess what the top question I got asked last year was for Alfresco features. The question was, when is the CMIS browser binding coming? So many of you might not know that CMIS has got different bindings, different ways you can call it. And new in 4.2 is the JSON-based browser binding. So that means that you can call CMIS using JSON. You couldn't do it until just recently launched. And combine that with the RESTful API, they're both JSON-based. So I'm hoping that some people are going to write some great apps on top of Alfresco using just JSON. So you can do it in the browser. All the hipster people writing their code, they can use JSON in the browser, just calling it. There are libraries, so CMIS libraries, client libraries for particular languages, but if you just want to, just use the JSON. I'm going to show you some of that in a bit. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the public API, and that's going to be groundwork for a little bit more work in a minute. The public API was designed, as I said, these great minds came together to try and bring some consistency. So there's an awful lot of APIs already used by Share, for instance. But the public API is to try and get a consistent understanding across the different calls. So you'll find that the URLs are similar, the structure is similar, the HTTP methods are similar. The response format is always a fixed format, so that if you wrote, say, a widget, you could always handle it in the same way. And there's common error handling, and also the way you actually talk to the API is the same. I'm going to show you some demos in a minute, so it'll become clearer. In terms of CMIS, there's a couple of talks I'd recommend. There's Getting Started with CMIS, Jeff Potts, and What's Coming in CMIS 1.1. They're all, those are links again to the sessions. I think they're today, I'm not sure. Or there's the book, CMIS and Apache Chemistry in Action, or the Apache Chemistry project itself. Okay, I'm just going to go into a little bit detail on the URLs, and this is groundwork for what we're going to do next. The top one is the browser binding URL. This is the one that I thought people get excited about. That's CMIS versions 1 browser binding. If you call that locally, you'll get the JSON response. And the bottom one's the public API, which I'm just going to talk about. So I said that this API is available in both cloud and, is that clear? Not especially, sorry about that. I'll nip through these quickly then. The top URL is the cloud, and the bottom URL is my local machine. So as you can see, from the word default, it's the same API, and you can just call that. If you want to write an app that works on the cloud, you develop it locally, and you can just run it on the cloud. And it's the structure, I was talking about consistency of structure, it's made up of this URL pattern. So default there is more relevant for the cloud. So in the cloud, you can be multi-tenant or multi-networks. You can be members of different networks. And I work for Alfresco, so mine would be alfresco.com. it would be for you mycompany.com, or you can use this special keyword default. And then the API namespace is, we've got 2 official APIs at the moment, Alfresco or Workflow. And then when you get to versions 1, you can then actually address the entities with whether it's a site, people, tags, or networks. So I'm just going to take this URL apart a little bit, take the front off it, and move it down. Yeah. That's the full URL. I'm just going to rush through it because it's not very clear. So that's the full URL structure for you. So scope, you can have public or private. Namespace would be Alfresco or Workflow. Versions 1. We've only got 1 version at the moment, but if a new version comes out, we'd have version 2. We might add to the version 1 API. So if it's just adding something and not breaking something, we'll just add to version 1. But if it's a breaking change, we'll version our API for you. And then you'll know that you can use version 1 or version 2 at the same time. And then the entity is usually a plural, so sites, people, a unique ID, and a relationship. So members, this is site members, it's called to site members. It's only relevant within the site itself. So that's why we call this a related entity. And unique ID. And that's not an exhaustive list of the API calls. And I also realize it's not very clear. But if I read out some of those, you can do like node tags, node ratings, node comments, site members, people favorites, people activities, people site membership requests, and tags. So those are the standard API calls. And I'm not expecting you to write this URL down, don't worry. But this is a link to the documentation. I'd recommend you check it out. Now I'm going to just show you that call. Here's the documentation, just so you know. That was that link. And it's very well documented. I can say that I didn't write the documentation. It's very well documented, certainly better than I do. And it's all under this Alfresco 1 API here, the CMIS, REST. And it explains to you, if you're going to use it in the cloud, how you do it, if you're using it on-premise. So the cloud uses OAuth 2 for authentication, and on-premise would use whatever web scripts authentication use, so basic auth. Right, let me just show you a call. So just before we started, I authorized this app. This is a browser app to Alfresco Cloud. So I'm hoping that if I call this URL and the internet works, let's have to go up here. Yeah. Hold on. Yeah. So that was a call to Alfresco Cloud. I'll show you the URL in a minute. But essentially, this is what I was talking about, the structure. So every call in our API is structured this way. We've got a list with pagination information and then various entries. So this, who's this person? Some Accenture has just added a file for their presentation, looks like. And so this is all the activities. So what I actually called, I don't know if you can see that URL very well at the top, is activities with a maximum items of 50 on api.alfresco.com. And equally, because it's a consistent API, I can also call this locally. So if I change to localhost, add basic authentication. Yeah, that works. So if you can see here, the way I'm doing the URL, the base URL, and I'm using the word default, public Alfresco versions 1, people me activities, get. I'm basically just calling the API, getting the results. And locally, there's not a lot of activity going on. So I'm just going to briefly show you this sort of consistency. So I'm going to do people to get my favorites. Here's the call, people, me, favorites. So another keyword you can use is me. It's quite useful to know. You can either put your own, normally put your ID in for that, or you can put the word me. So if you don't know who you are, say you're using OAuth, that's how you'd call to get your favorites. And I'm not authorized, which is Probably because I haven't put the header on. Yeah. So I've got one favorite, some sample website. So what I'm going to do is delete that favorite. I hope I copied that right. So to do that, let's call a get first to just demonstrate this. Okay, so I just got the content down here. If I change that, it's the same URL. If I change that to a delete, I get a 204 no content, which means I've actually deleted it. So this is what I was talking about, consistent API. You call a delete or a get, turns the right message response. And so I better add it back in. So to add it back in, I do a post to this URL. Did I put the header on? Yeah, and I got a 201 created there, and I've added the post back in. That's basic usage of the API. Read the documentation, use it. Use that combined with CMIS, and you should be able to write great apps. That's it for that demo. Go back to the presentation. Okay, so hopefully from that brief demo, I show you the consistency of the public API, that it works across cloud and on-premise. It's JSON-based, RESTful, and hopefully I think you find that's easy to use. I use it in the browser. It's very straightforward, well documented. So now we're going to look at how you get started with Alfresco, how you'd get up and running, and what you'd use it for. Thankfully, I've got a blue background, so hopefully that's a little bit easier to read. So we're going to use the Alfresco Maven SDK, and this would be my recommendation for how you get up and running on Alfresco. There's a talk tomorrow, I think it is, by Gab Colombo on rapid development, and that's going to go into more detail about the SDK, but we are going to look at it today. I'm also going to, I've just done this is a sample app that I'm just going to show you that is available for you to try out. It uses the SDK, so we're going to have a little look at that. So what I showed you already is the API, and what I did to help with that is that I created a little framework built on web scripts for this API to make it easy to develop. And this just summarizes what we did. So it's kind of built on web scripts. It still uses web scripts, but it's slightly different. You don't define web scripts in the same way. It's consistent. There's very little XML required. It doesn't use free markers, so it uses Pojos and Jackson. So it's very standard, I think you'd say. And it uses annotations for the nouns, for the endpoints, so for sites or people, and interfaces for the verbs, which is a get, put, post. And I came up with this slogan when I was on the bus, and I'm quite proud of myself, but I'm not in marketing, you can tell. So the summary of what I thought the framework would do is that you write the Java, and we'll handle the rest. And the source code is available there. I'll show you that slide in a minute. So this is the sample code on GitHub. As you can see, it uses the Maven Alfresco SDK. So just a little bit about the Maven Alfresco SDK. There's various archetypes that you can use to get started with Alfresco. Like I said, there's another talk tomorrow on this, so I'm going to cover it a little bit, but not in great detail. I would recommend you give it a go. It should get up and running. It uses a H2 database, in-memory database, and also embedded Gethin. So you should be able to get up and running pretty quickly. Well, Obviously, Maven has to download the internet before you can get going, but generally, it should be pretty quickly. You just put a version number of the Alfresco you want to use, and that would download Alfresco, start it up for you, and you can be developing against it and developing amps. For those of you who don't know what an amp is, it's an Alfresco module package, which is basically a fancy name for a zip file, but is a slightly special format. It's got a module properties file. In it, there's some advantages for using amps in that if you build an amp, then you can just employ it on any other Alfresco instance. It's self-contained, and it's the fairly well understood method of packaging for your code. So today we're going to have a look at the Alfresco amp archetype, and I'll flick over to my IDE. No, maybe I'll flick here. Just to say, so the code's here on GitHub. You can see there's only 11 commits. There's not much to it, thankfully. And what I did, instead of going absolutely step by step through everything today, when I created this project, I wrote down everything I did as far as I could remember and created step-by-step instructions here. So if you're a Maven user, you do MVN archetype generate, that whole line, you can cut and paste that in and get started. And these are the answers I even answered to the questions when I created the archetype: 1.3, project name, quick rest, yes. And these step-by-step instructions are here. There's actually not that many. And even these commits, so when I updated the POM, I've even referenced the commit view. So you can see what I actually did in that physical commit, like change the description. So this should be, hopefully, a really quick way of you getting up to speed with Alfresco. There's a couple of branches. I've got a groovy one, and ready for development is ready for development. Master's got a sample hello world on it. And basically you create the archetype, you can follow these instructions, and then you type this MVN integration test amp to war command, and that'll start up Alfresco and you'll be running against it. I've actually done that in another terminal window already. And then you can access it on this URL. So in terms of the code, unfortunately it's quite a long room, isn't it? Hopefully you can see from the back, the left-hand side, a little bit. It's just the structure. So if you're familiar with Maven, source main Java, source test resources. There's also source main amp there, which is, again, you'll find all the documentation on the Maven SDK. It should tell you everything you need to know about it. Yeah, hopefully that's a bit bigger. Let's move that. Looks like I can't drag that. All right, I'll leave that. Oh, well, you can see the middle. So what I'm going to show you is how you can add to that public API we just saw, hopefully quickly and easily, and hopefully without XML. So on the left-hand side, you may be able to see that there's two classes, really. There's a packageinfo.java, which has this special annotation in. So alongside my hello entity resource class, I've got a packageinfo.java class, and it's got this annotation which says web API name. Let me just see if I can make that easier for you. There we go. In the package info, I've got this annotation. As you can see, the URL that will actually be used is that URL. So private my company versions 1. So this is how you'd add your own company API to the existing API. You combine that with another annotation, which is an entity resource annotation, and you get that full URL above. So by doing these two things together, you can add on to the Alfresco API very quickly. If I annotate a class with entity resource, and I put the name hello, that is the definition of the endpoint that you're going to use. You can see the URL above. Private my company version 1 hello, and then some text is what I'm going to enter in anything. So that's what I talked about, nouns for the annotations for the noun, sorry. And then to actually implement a method, you implement an interface. And hopefully this is what I was talking about when I said you write the Java, don't handle about the rest. You write the interface, and in the documentation you can say the HTTP method, but you just need to implement these interfaces here, which are create, read, delete, read by ID, update, this basic CRUD. If you're familiar with JAX-RS or Spring MVC, this won't be new to you. It's kind of very standard, or Google Cloud Endpoints. They all use these annotations for the endpoints. It's a similar sort of idea. And one thing with this is that once you've annotated this as an entity resource, this is now a Spring Bean, and you've got full access to the other Java APIs, which I'll show you. So basically, you just implement that interface. That's the method that implements that interface. You've got a parameter, and you can call it. So let's call that, shall we? There we go. So everyone. Oh, typo. So that's basically just show you how to quickly, in a couple of lines of code, add to the public API. I did say to you there was no XML. There's nearly no XML. I've just put in a Spring component scan there. That's how it's working. So if you understand Spring, you'll understand what I'm doing. It's component scan the classes, wiring them in as beans. Okay, another sample to show you. Again, I've got the package info and the different class. I have to confess that the examples here aren't very good. I was thinking, how could I add to the Alfresco API? But there's an awful lot in there already, and I struggled for examples. But I will show you the source code shortly, which is show you where the source code is, so you can look at all the examples of how we've implemented them already. So this is an example of how you add to the existing API. We already have an API which gets you node ID, say comments, for instance. And this annotation will allow you to add, say, I've added folders here, to the end of that namespace. And if you remember, I was talking about a relationship resource before. This is just a similar sort of annotation. You annotate your class with a relationship resource, and you say the endpoint, which matches the URL endpoint there. And then you say it's related to another entity. And you do that by just this entity resource definition here, and say nodes entity resource.class. That's how you relate them together. And then implement the interface to read by ID. So again, you can see I've got 2 lines of code, more or less, and I'm adding to the API. This particular example is going to use the service registry. So this is a Spring Bean. It's already auto-wired. You can reference the service registry, and I'm going to call the file folder service list folders. I'm doing something a little bit naughty here in that I'm just going to sling out the Java object that comes from the file folder service list folders, which is probably not designed in mind to be serialized as JSON, so it's going to look a bit ugly. But what I'm trying to show here is that you're writing a Java API and you've got the full power of Alfresco straight in there for your extensions, for your add-ons. So I need to call, the API, but I don't know a node ID yet to call it with. So what I'm going to use is the CMIS workbench. Is this working? Yep. This is the CMIS workbench. Hopefully you'll see that in some of the other presentations. This allows you to browse, read all sorts of information on CMIS, using CMIS, about the Alfresco repository. So I'm going to go into site. It's all using the CMIS standard. You can see all the properties on it, relationships, information. So say I wanted to find out all the folders in this directory. You could use CMIS for this, which I'd probably recommend. But in our example, we're going to, oops, well, that's not good, is it? Hopefully in our example, we're going to be able to reference a node. I've actually moved on to documents there. You basically reference the node, call the method, and it will return the results. So my final example is similar to the folders where I'm going to use documents. The slight difference here is I'm going to pass a parameter in. So hopefully you'll use CMIS. You won't actually have to write this stuff because the API should be all you need. But if you do have to extend it, this example is I'm going to allow you to get documents and also pass in an XPath. So Alfresco allows you to specify XPath search parameters. So as a parameter, you can also add an XPath to your node request. And this is using the search service select nodes, pass in the XPath. If you don't pass one in, it's using star, I think. So that's what this call is. This is, yeah. This is a call to documents on a node. See, there's pagination information as before. There's 11 entries, and these are all images, I think. Yeah. As you can see, this is 3.8K, so they're very small requests. You can actually do more with that if you want to. You can actually just say you want part of the object as well. And the XPath I haven't put one in, so I'm going to just check what I can do here. So for instance, for this call, I've had an XPath to the end of it. You probably can't see the URL. So basically I'm going to say, for all these images, 11 images you've got there, which ones were taken with a Canon camera? So I've just put in the XPath for that, which is the EXIF manufacturer Canon. And I've got 2 results. And so I could even restrict this more by saying, I just want to get the, let's have a look, the title of these by, so in the API you can always use the word properties and then just choose the ones you're interested in. Oops. That's an and, isn't it? There we go. So now the response is 1.78 bytes. It's very small. Okay, so what I haven't shown you behind the scenes is this output from my terminal. I thought I'd try and hide you from that. That's basically the Maven SDK. So it did start up. I just stop it. So I'm just in that project, and I typed mvn clean integration test amp to r. Oh, you can't see at the bottom. Hold on. Yeah. I just typed that command, and that's how it ran. I can show you that a little bit more at the end if you're interested. But I recommend you go to the Maven talk tomorrow to get you more information. There's various commands. Again, in the GitHub project, I've referenced the other Maven AMP commands that you can use. So once you've developed your application, if you just do mvn package, that'll just package you up an AMP that you can then ship to your customers or whatever you do with it. We're almost there. Okay. So, as I said, my examples weren't the best examples, but if you want to see some real good examples of how you do this, the top one there, that folder, the API folder there, is where all the implementation is for these APIs. So just go to the Alfresco public SVN repository. That's the destination, and API is where you see all the APIs. Workflow at the bottom is for the workflow API that's brand new, and the framework's the bit in between that I've just described. So I'm just going to summarize what we've talked about. Firstly, you may remember I asked you, do you like choices? So there's lots of choices that you can do on Alfresco. You can use lots of different languages, lots of different ways, and it's open source as well, so you've got an awful lot of different options. You don't have to use Java. You can use JavaScript, Groovy, Python. A lot of the, say, CMIS libraries have got other language clients that you can use. I've also scratched the surface, really. You know, there's lots of training courses on how to get on developing on Alfresco, and I haven't covered that. For instance, data models, one of the key, most important things that you might want to do, but I haven't talked about that today. There's plenty of other people around that would talk about that, or you could go to a training course. It's certainly key that you can add your own data model on top of Alfresco for your requirements. My other top tip is to use CMIS. I think I've mentioned that a few times. Hopefully, my recommendation is to use CMIS wherever you can. And that would mean that you can use your code on other CMIS compliant repositories. And hopefully it's a standard that you can understand. Similarly, use the Maven SDK. I have hidden a little bit of what I was using with the Maven SDK today. That sample app that I showed you, go and try it out and see if it works for you. I'm around at the end here, but also there's, I think it's called Alfresco Experts Bar, which is basically you can book time with me or any other engineers to talk about stuff. So if you want to try any of these demos out or try any of the code out, feel free to book a slot with me, and then we can talk about it more. I'll be really interested also if you're developing solutions on top of Alfresco and maybe you've got some pain points or there's some things that don't work. Again, come and see me. I'd be happy to talk to you about the tooling. And also there's the more Summit talks. So like I said in my slides, I'm trying to point you towards other talks that you might find interesting. This is the first of the technical sessions. So feel free to go to the other CMIS talks, the Maven SDK talks, to find out more about Alfresco. And that's it. I've got 5 minutes for questions. That's not bad. There's a question straight away there.
What about the SOAP API? What about the SOAP API? Is it going to die?
I think personally I'd like it to die. I think it's still supported. Am I right in thinking it's still supported at the moment?
It works.
I
mean,
it's
works
still
in 4.0. It works, but are you going to remove it in, I don't know, 4.5, 5.0?
I don't make those decisions, but I imagine we will move it. We will remove it sometime in the future. So I wouldn't recommend any new development on the SOAP API. Certainly, I'd recommend the JSON binding, I think.
Okay, and if you allow me one more question,
sure.
Please. This Maven SDK, it supposedly works with Alfresco 4.2. So if I build an amp with it, would it work on 4.0? Because I built it and I saw it's almost the same, but there are slight differences, and I tried to deploy it. It didn't work. Is it because of me, or would you expect it to work?
I think it depends on what you're using from 4.0. If you're using the core API, then it shouldn't have changed very much. So it should, in theory, work on 4.0.
Okay.
Yeah, you just have to test it out and see, I think. Any more questions?
I think for Maven, there is no corporate repository really governed by Alfresco itself, right?
No, there's artifacts.alfresco.com is our Maven repository where you can download the artifacts that's got public artifacts in, and also I believe there's a partners one as well, which I can't remember the URL off the top of my head, which has the other artifacts in.
So there's really, it's really hosted and governed by Alfresco itself, because everything I saw was Google Code or third-party community. So it's really warranted by Alfresco that it will be available?
Every build goes up to the Alfresco's artifacts.alfresco.com. Even I think the nightly builds also go there, I think.
Cool. Okay, thanks.
Any more?
So you talked about choices.
Yeah.
What would be, well, at least your recommendation, or better even official recommendation, when do you use the REST APIs and when you use CMIS?
Well, I suppose I'll speak for myself. I'd recommend that you use CMIS for everything you can.
Okay.
As a standard. So if you can't use CMS, then you have to use something else, but say the public REST API. But generally, I'd try and recommend that you use CMS.
It would be still the same Maven SDK, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Same.
Thanks.
Just a very quick question. Is the public API enterprise only, or is it on the community version?
It's in community. Okay, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.